The morning brought little relief, for the sun only occasionally peeps through the grey clouds, giving us too little warmth. By noon our ATP was providing cover for our infantry units advancing on Feodosia. In front of us lay an open field. On the dry steppe the infantry was moving relentlessly toward the sea, and from here the soldiers seemed like small dots disappearing over the horizon. In the first hours of the offensive, the harbour was bombed by our things, and we could distinguish burning houses, warehouses, oil tanks and factory areas on the approaches to Sari Gol, and over the harbour of Feodosia in the clear winter sky hung a heavy black cloud of smoke. Suddenly from positions in our rear heard the sounds of gunfire. One of the vehicles attached to the ATT, standing in a hollow about 100 metres behind the positions, appeared in front of us, pursued by indiscriminate rifle and machine gun fire. We turned the gun to the rear, unable to see the enemy. Reaching us, driver Fier fell out of the cab and "The Russians are behind us. They have captured the assembly point." He said that he managed to hear the noise of the alarm raised at the regimental headquarters. He knew nothing about the fate of the second driver, although he saw him also jump into the cab of his car in full view of the approaching Russians. Cher assumed that the truck was hit by a shell. Later we searched for the truck and found the driver lying on the steering wheel, killed by a single shot to the head. Finally the attackers poured out of the hollow. At least 100 Russians rushed toward our 7-man gun crew and one machine gun nest with loud shouts of hurrah. Rifle shots struck the side of the vehicle and ricocheted off the edge of the gun shield. Hans grabbed the machine gun. Placing his machine gun across the ammunition trailer, he fired a long burst. The first shrapnel shell of our gun hit the chest of the tall Russian, and his severed torso bounced off the ground. Through the rattle of the guns, the shouts of hurrah began to be heard more quietly. A pile of bodies in khaki-coloured uniforms was growing in front of us. Despite our fierce resistance, they continued to advance under the cover of machine gun and rifle fire, like a swarm of insects unwilling to turn back. Through the magnifying optics of the scope, the Soviet soldiers looked big and terrible. The flashes of bursts from the muzzles of their automatic rifles filled the entire scope. I began to aim at the enemy soldiers one by those who were closest to us soon lay motionless, but more ghosts kept appearing from the hollow. Suddenly our machine gun jammed. Under a hail of rifle bullets our ammunition carrier snatched new shells from the loading boxes, and the loaders, drenched in sweat, despite the cold, continued one after another to drive the shells into the hot breech of our gun. The non-commissioned officer lying beside me near the carriage wheel was firing short, monotonous bursts from his automatic rifle, and suddenly he leaned back, groaning with pain. We had no time to help the wounded man, only to shoot to save our lives. Having cleared the jammed feed chute, Hans opened fire again from his Spandau. The mountain of shell casings behind the gun continued to grow. Someone shouted, "Last box of fragmentation shells." The high explosive shells were quickly expended, and we continued to fire armor-piercing shells at the lone silhouettes. The stretcher-bearers knelt with carbines on the right side of the carriage and opened fire toward the flank as several Russians tried to surround us, throwing hand grenades which exploded before reaching us 20 yards away. The Russians desperately continued their attack to prevent the harbour of Theodosia from falling into our hands. In spite of their personal bravery, they were dying in vain. The rumble of the guns slowly died down, and in the meantime the survivors of the enemy crawled back under the protection of the hollow. They were then captured by our infantry units sent to comb the area. The wounded non-commissioned officer was still lying under the protection of our ATAT. We cut open his boot and bandaged his leg, in which the bullet had hit just below the knee. The exit wound was visible, a lump of bloody flesh protruding from the foot. We carried the non-commissioned officer to the only surviving vehicle, and Fiat drove him to the rear. Then we learned that he had been evacuated further to the central hospital, where field surgeons had to amputate his left leg. For the next 12 hours we combed the surrounding area and brought in more prisoners, many of whom were wounded. They were sent under escort to regimental headquarters. Our infantry companies dashed forward, reaching the shore of the Black Sea. On the spearhead of the attack was the I Battalion of the 436th Infantry Regiment. Its flank was covered by the 437th Infantry Regiment. Late in the afternoon, Sarigol, the northern outskirts of Feodosia, was in our hands, and all approaches from the north and south were covered. This battle decided the fate of the still unoccupied city of Theodosia. In an official report, General von Manstein noted that our 132nd Infantry Division led the decisive breakthrough to the sea. On January 18, the remaining Russian units, still holding Assam Bay, broke through the German defense line and began to attack combat units, destroying communication cables and creating interference in our rear. They suffered heavy losses under concentrated artillery fire, and after several days were dispersed and finally eliminated as an organized force. During the struggle at Sarigol, the enemy landing troops suffered heavy losses. Dead bodies densely dotted the streets and seashore. At night from January 17 to 18, Russian tanks tried to break through the German encirclement, but exploded on anti-tank mines placed by our sappers on the southern outskirts of Sarigol. The division headed northeast, and on January 19 and 20 we reached the defense lines to the east and northeast. Far Kamaishi was ordered to be held until the Kerch operation began. On January 19, the 438th Infantry Regiment captured the area west of the coastal road from Far Kamishi and adjacent heights. The advance proceeded according to plan, meeting weak enemy resistance. During the morning hours, the division headquarters was redeployed to near Beibuga. All movements took place under pesky enemy air raids, despite snowfall and cloudy skies. The raids by Stuka, dive bombers and artillery fire caused very heavy destruction to the structures of Feodosia and the surrounding areas. Several damaged transport ships lay in the harbour. The enemy had abandoned many military cargoes in the abandoned areas. On January 20, the activity of enemy aircraft increased. In the evening, an order from the Corps was received to start preparing defensive positions near Dalny Kamishi. January 21, the headquarters of the division was transferred to Feodosia. The temperature dropped to -30 degrees. The Wehrmacht report of January 19 on the battle for Feodosia reads as follows. German and Union troops under the command of Infantry General von Manstein, coordinating their actions with the Luftwaffe under the command of Air Force General Ritter von Greim, pushed back the Soviet troops and occupied the city of Feodosia. 4,600 people were taken prisoner, 73 armoured vehicles, 77 field guns, and a large amount of war materials were captured. The successful conclusion of the battle for Feodosia eliminated any danger to the army in the Crimea. In the defence on the narrow Kerch Peninsula stood XX Army Corps, with the 132nd Infantry Division in the vanguard. On our left, HUXI Army Corps with the 42nd Infantry Division and the 18th Romanian Infantry Division in reserve. The Russian attempt to break through from the Feodosia sector in the direction of Dyshankoi, Perikop and bypass the bulk of the 11th Army was unsuccessful. As a result of constant attempts to break through the isolated forces of the Soviet troops, was ordered to concentrate on the elimination of all pockets of enemy resistance still remaining in our rear. The order was received to stop for rest in Sarigol. The troops had been brought to an extreme degree of exhaustion since the outbreak of war with Russia, especially in the fierce battles near Sevastopol and Feodosia. Infantry companies, as well as sapper units, tank fighters, reconnaissance battalions, forward artillery observers, and rear guard units repeatedly demonstrated how a good soldier should act in a given situation, regardless of the enemy's strength, if given the right training and given good command. My gun crew was enjoying a respite. We encamped near the company rear at Sarigol, set aside for regimental reserves. Immediately after taking the town, we found another sturdy stone house with 2 rooms, standing near the railroad and very similar to our former dwelling. In the house lived Mamushka, a full Ukrainian woman of about 55 years of age, with a rounded, cheerful face. Her daughter Marysia, 35 years of age, and Pan, the master of the house. A native of the Crimea, was a man of frail build with a large, sagging patriarchal moustache, and even in warm weather he never removed his black scribbled cap. This vaguely aged, small, angular man could be either 40 or 60 years old. Before the road of war ran through the land of his homeland, he worked as a station master in the Feodosia branch of the railroad. We quickly became accustomed to our three hosts, who occupied the front room of the house. At the right wall of the building was a stove built of brick on lime mortar with an iron door, and the back of the room was occupied by a huge wide wooden cropt, in which all three of us slept. The second room contained two metal beds, a dark brown walnut closet and a night table, which was enlivened by a well-tended houseplant. I allowed myself the luxury of sleeping on one of the metal beds on real mattresses, while the others settled on the floor. The house was warm and comfortable, and even the nightly thunder of Russian naval batteries of large caliber bothered us little. The only misunderstanding had to do with Mamushka, as we were carelessly hammering nails into the wall and front door of the closet to hang our flasks, cartridge tapes, and other field equipment. Mamushka began to run rapidly back and forth, shaking her handkerchief-covered head, now and then exclaiming, "Nix good. No culture." We immediately removed all the nails, and she calmed down again. We had at our disposal old-fashioned, still Tsarist times furniture. The house had electrical wiring, but there was no electricity, so we relied on old oil lamps, typical of Russian huts, which gave a diffuse but warm light. Army rations remained sparse and monotonous. Bread rations were again cut back. With the capture of the village, we received a supplement to our rations, which now consisted mainly of canned meat. While inspecting a Russian truck, which had been partially destroyed by a hit from an assault gun shell, we found sacks of dry bread and long-smoked sausage, which tasted like the Krakow sausage familiar to us in Germany. In search of food, we searched an abandoned shack near the harbour where we found large cardboard boxes filled with soap. On further inspection, we were surprised to find large sacks of corn and sugar hidden under a pile of soap. Having obtained such supplies, Heinz, formerly a baker in Karlsruhe, prepared a marvellous meal of sugared semolina, which we ate greedily with pieces of Russian sausage. We had enough to eat and shared it with Mamushka, Marussia, and Pan, who had no food. The news spread quickly through the company about how well our gun crew was doing, and we had a steady stream of visitors. Hans came to see me too, and we sat down and talked about our homes in Württemberg, which lay 3,000 kilometers away. We filled some empty cartridge boxes with food and sugar and hid the treasure among the stacks of shell boxes. Because we had extra rations, the company gave us the honorary title of hoarding calculation. While searching the warehouses on the pier, we came across 2 large tanks of liquid. Hoping to find fuel for our vehicles, we carefully examined these tanks. Inside, we found 3 shivering Russian soldiers who had been standing up to their shoulders in oil for several days. Assured that they would be shot immediately on capture, they preferred to die of frost or drown in the terrible conditions rather than surrender. We took them to the harbour master's headquarters, where they were given other clothing and then left at the mercy of obscurity. One afternoon we were inspecting an abandoned factory. As soon as I entered a long passage and moved slowly forward, a hand grenade with a hissing fuse flew out of the darkness and rolled at my feet. I instinctively threw it back with my foot into the dark room, at the same time grabbing Hans, who, unaware of what was happening, had come up behind me and tearing him into the next room. At that instant the grenade exploded, filling the air with dust and debris. Our ears were still ringing from the explosion as we jumped to our feet with automatic rifles at the ready, as 5 Russians came stumbling toward us with their arms raised. The hand grenade rolled backwards across the corridor and exploded almost at their feet. Stunned but not wounded, they surrendered without any resistance. Sweeping through captured neighborhoods was not without risk. I derived personal satisfaction from the consciousness that, though solely responsible for the safety of my gun crew, I could have unbounded confidence in the judgment and physical ability of my comrades. This faith had been strengthened during the months at the front to the point where only death or severe wounds could shake it. After the winter battles at Feodosia from January 15 to 18, the fighting on the narrow Kerch Peninsula was reduced to trench warfare. The Russians held well-prepared positions against us. Their defense line consisted of a vast network of deep trenches, minefields and tank traps. All breakthrough attempts made by the enemy from late February to early May, our division successfully repulsed. The Soviet troops, especially when attacking the left wing of Height 50.6, suffered heavy losses. Despite enemy attacks using tanks and a vastly superior number of rifle divisions, our defences continued to hold. Local breakthroughs in the defence line held by the 44th Infantry Division on our left and in the area for which the Romanian Brigade was responsible were eliminated. All along the eastern front, the Russians were trying to reclaim the territories given to the German army the previous summer and thus take the initiative away from the German forces. They also took great advantage of the fact that they continued to control the Black Sea, and our troops and positions were frequently bombarded by Soviet naval ships freely cruising the Black Sea. The liberation of Crimea remained paramount, as possession of it would allow the Soviets to throw air power against the weak flank of the southern front and also make the Romanian oil fields within reach of their bombers. The loss of Crimea to the Soviets was to be decisive in determining Turkey's still unclear role in the war. We later learned that the Russians had optimistically dubbed their offensive a Stalinist strike, and we had no doubt that the Soviets would do anything to recapture Crimea. Air reconnaissance revealed that the enemy was steadily building up forces on the Kerch Peninsula. The Kerch Strait was covered with ice for several weeks a year and was suitable for transportation all the way to the Caucasus. This unexpected advantage gave the Russians the ability to transport troops and ammunition from the mainland over the ice. For both German soldiers and Soviet infantry, a costly trench warfare began. Troops dug trenches and erected barriers day and night. Lack of woods made it difficult to build dugouts, and logs had to be delivered from far away, from the rear and from the Yaela Mountains. The division's engineers set minefields and built a complex system of wire barriers. Thanks to the tireless efforts and physical exertion of the troops, the enemy did not succeed in their attempts to break through our positions. Last year, during our fighting for Sevastopol, the 46th Infantry Division captured the Kerch Peninsula and the port. During this period of fighting, the division was commanded by General Spolnik, who faced in December 1941, on the flank with a powerful enemy grouping, ordered the withdrawal of troops from the peninsula. This action was a direct violation of Hitler's policy of holding the invaded at all costs, so an investigation into the general's actions was ordered. Because of Spolnik's independent actions, the commander of the Southern Front issued an order, henceforth categorically prohibiting any awarding of personnel of this division. This measure of mass retaliation, which we all felt was wrong, was clearly the result of a direct order from Hitler, who emphasized that troops must hold their positions at all costs and forbade the withdrawal of troops from any captured territory. The case of Count Spolnik has shown us the conflict of principles in which a military leader can find himself. In this case, an experienced general took the initiative to save his troops in a ruinous situation by disobeying a sweeping order that took no account of exceptional circumstances. Spolnik knew that in case of failure he risked not only his position, but also his own life. By order of the Army High Command, Spolnik was relieved of his post. Tribunal chaired by Reichsmarschall Göring after a short meeting sentenced the brave and gifted officer to death. This sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment. General Spolnik suffered the fate of many. He perished in the draconian National Socialist justice system. Although his fate remains unknown, he was most likely executed during the reprisals that followed the attempt on Hitler's life on July 20, 1944. Field Marshal von Bock, Commander-in-Chief of Army Group South, later issued this order on the 46th Infantry Division. The 46th Division has consistently demonstrated outstanding fighting qualities in defensive battles, with the enemy since the beginning of January over the corridor. As such, the division has earned special recognition. Recommendations for promotion and decoration will be considered and approved immediately. As we continued to endure the hardships of a harsh war on the Eastern Front, our chances of remaining unscathed became increasingly elusive. Accounts of the fate of German soldiers who fell into Russian hands and died slowly and painfully in captivity were widely circulated. These stories of Soviet brutality only strengthened in the German soldier the will to fight and resist to the last cartridge and the last breath. As human beings, we were capable of great displays of courage, but we lacked the talent for suicide. The war in the East had degenerated to such an extent that we considered surrendering as tantamount to suicide. At the end of February, the ATI calculation entrenched its gun on a piece of terrain officially called Turtle. We sought shelter from the frost and the freezing wind in dilapidated barns where sheep used to live, and settled as best we could between the damp clay walls. The roof fell victim to numerous shell fragments, and we organized our defensive position with an almost circular sector of fire. From these heights, the Black Sea was visible on the right. In the foreground was the town of Dolny Kamyshy with its factory. To the right, on the seaside cliffs, at about 1,500 meters, was clearly visible fortified Point Icebreaker. Besides Dolny Kamyshy, Turtle, and Icebreaker, there were other infantry positions, such as Grasshopper near the former silo. To our left we could see a front that stretched beyond the frozen swamp, all the way up the hill called Hill 66.3. On a clear day we could see at least a third of the Parpek position. We set up our firing position about 50 meters from our dwelling and built a curved earthen rampart for 360-degree circular protection from shell fragments and mines. Our position could be reached relatively safely through a continuous trench we had made in the rocky ground. We tried to make our position as safe and comfortable as possible under the available conditions, but we longed for the simple wooden huts in which we were housed at our former position. On February 22, I visited Hans. His firing position was on Korokel Hill, on the shore of the Black Sea in the Coast Guard. 2 days later, he was killed. Bundeswehr Volk's platoon of tank fighters stood 3-4 kilometers from the front lines in the Coast Guard system, near a conspicuous White House near Kamyshy. Orders had been given to the platoons concentrated in quiet coastal sectors to assemble for briefing, and on the morning of February 24, visibility was limited by fog and haze, making observation of distant targets equally impossible for both home and foreigners. Falk's platoon had assembled at the White House with 20 other soldiers to receive a briefing from the platoon commander when a single shell exploded almost at their feet. Of that platoon, 5 men, including Hans, died instantly or were so badly wounded that they died hours later. 12 others received wounds that proved to be non-fatal. After this incident, an order went out authorizing only small, isolated groups to conduct classes. Shortly afterward, a second incident occurred when a number of forward observers who had gathered together on a single water tower near the Far Reeds factory were killed. To get a better view of enemy positions, observers from an artillery unit, infantry companies, and several mortar platoons had positioned themselves in an unprotected position. A direct hit by a single artillery shell on this position killed and wounded all the observers. After this incident, an order went out prohibiting the congregation of observers in this form. Operation Bustard Hunt was prepared to drive Soviet troops out of the Crimea. In the anti-tank ditches of Feodosia, the battalions underwent intensive training for the planned attack on the enemy earth fortifications at the Parpek site. Explosive charges were prepared to eliminate enemy wire fences, and assault ladders were made to take enemy trenches. At 6:30 a.m. On February 26, the enemy opened heavy artillery and mortar fire along the entire front. At 8:30, the fire shaft sharply dried up, and infantry units supported by heavy tanks came at us. Near the height, Telegrafnaya planned a breakthrough by 9 enemy tanks, one of which was destroyed by the 4th Battery of the Artillery Regiment of our division. 3 more tanks were put out of action by the fire of the 5th Battery. The remaining tanks withdrew. Of the 9 attacking tanks, 7 were destroyed or disabled and remained on the battlefield. By 10.0, the attack was repulsed throughout the sector and the enemy retreated, suffering heavy losses. A downpour, which did not cease all night and day, gave us a great advantage while we held our defences. The soil was soaked with water and softened to such an extent that it was possible to move only slowly and with great difficulty in the open field. At 1 p.m., the enemy troops again attempted to attack Telegraph Naya Heights. This attack was repulsed by concentrated fire. In the morning of February 27, the enemy hit the defensive line along the Parpacha with all artillery on pre-shot targets. Our positions were raided by bombers and fighter squadrons. The incessant fire on the German positions was joined by Russian gunboats and destroyers shelling the division's trenches, plant and artillery positions in and around Dalny Kamaishi. Outnumbered, the Russians were trying to break through our positions. The thin strip of the German front was opposed by 7 rifle divisions and several tank brigades. In addition to these troops directly advancing on us, the Russian Army Command also held in reserve 6 or 7 rifle divisions, 1 cavalry division, and 2 tank brigades to be used to develop success in the event of a breakthrough. On March 3, 1942, the early morning sun illuminated a clear sky. Active movement of Russian troops towards Zaydschent was seen, with the narrow roads clogged with trucks, marching companies and wagons. During the night, enemy warships shelled Karakel, and in the morning hours the Russians fired about 200 medium-caliber artillery shells at the town. The rampart of fire swept along the coastal road and important positions on the railroad. After a short pause, between 12 noon and 2 p.m., heavy artillery rained down on the positions of the 5th and 6th batteries from the direction of Moscow. At the 6th battery, 1 gun was put out of action, and several numbers of the artillery crew were killed. During the night, our batteries fired 25 shells, each on the road crossing the anti-tank ditches. In the morning hours, the fire was poured on the concentrations of enemy troops. On the neighbouring left sector, the enemy launched powerful air attacks. Our aviation showed itself weakly. This artillery duel resulted in 2 killed and 7 wounded on our batteries. The divisional sector soon split into a number of strongholds, for which there was a fierce struggle, and the heaviest fighting took place near heights 50.6 and 66.3, as well as in the areas Turtle and Icebreaker, which accounted for a dozen attacks a day. Many tanks were destroyed during the period from February 27 to March 3, and then when massive attacks resumed in this sector from March 13 to 20. Local breakthroughs PA Icebreaker and Turtle, and on the perimeter of the left neighbouring sector, were quickly eliminated by counterattacks. Later we learned that the Russians broke through in the sector defended by the Romanian division, and this breakthrough could not stop the weakened German units on the Romanian flanks. With this situation, it became necessary to introduce a new tank division into the battle. This division was formed and equipped in France, and was largely armed with captured French tanks. The new division was scheduled to be used in the spring offensive, but now it was forced to knee-deep mud to meet the Russians. A column of tankers, superbly equipped in freshly tailored winter uniforms, rumbled past our positions to engage the enemy in the distance. We could not rid ourselves of the feeling that as they rumbled past, they looked at us with disdain, sitting on top of the turrets of their iron chariots. We looked enviously at the freshly dressed troops huddled in their trenches and struggled through the mud in uniforms that had become ragged, crusty, and faded during months of brutal fighting. The rookie tank units resolutely rushed to the attack. Clanking tracks and roaring engines in the frosty air, they immediately rushed into a frontal attack on the Russian positions, but got stuck in the deep mud right in front of the enemy guns, completely vulnerable to anti-tank fire. A total of 40 tanks were lost. The rest were immediately withdrawn from the front after this disastrous experiment and sent to the rear for further training. They had to learn, just as we had done in the preceding months, the realization that something more than new uniforms and a passionate onslaught was needed to be able to survive on the Eastern Front. By harsh tradition, the infantrymen later referred to this unit as the Cologne Division, referring to the fact that it came from the west and quickly evaporated. Soon an official order was issued forbidding the use of this offensive term, and it was no longer used by infantrymen on the front lines. Not surprisingly, however, the expression could sometimes be heard from soldiers who remained in rear areas, usually beyond the reach of Russian guns. On March 23, throughout the day, the enemy attacked Icebreaker with the strength of 1 battalion. The 437th Infantry Regiment was supported by assault guns, but heavy enemy artillery and mortar fire covered the entire area of Icebreaker and the neighbouring factory, forcing the infantrymen to hide in trenches and dugouts. Throughout the night, our batteries shelled the accumulations of enemy troops on the front of the Icebreaker. The enemy managed to capture the Icebreaker after the German defenders had used up all the ammunition. The powerful barrage of our artillery batteries prevented the enemy from taking advantage of this breakthrough to advance further. The Soviets suffered massive casualties and were unable to reach the anti-tank ditches east of the plant. Supported by the fire of artillery batteries and self-propelled guns, our infantry unit successfully recaptured Icebreaker by evening. The 1,600 artillery shells fired by our batteries prevented further enemy advance, even though the Soviets were able to bring in reinforcements. Throughout the heavy ground fighting, air activity remained negligible, and only 1 enemy bomber and 1 Raider fighter were shot down by our anti-aircraft fire. At 4:40 a.m. On April 9, the enemy launched a surprise attack supported by heavy artillery fire, raining down a hail of shells on our positions. At 7:00, enemy artillery fire in our sector slightly weakened, although the sector on the left continued to take the full brunt of enemy attacks. Tanks were introduced into the battle, and by noon the attack had weakened. Enemy guns and numerous troop concentrations came under fire from our batteries, but in spite of heavy pressure, the enemy was able to make another attack on our fortified point, officially called Siegfried. After several attempts, this attack was dispersed by artillery and infantry fire. The 5th Battery poured fire on a cluster of tanks at the northernmost tip of the swamp. Enemy activity in the air was regularly observed, using mostly primitive aircraft like the I-16. These planes attacked all targets in succession with light bombs and machine gun fire. At 11:30, our things attacked targets on the front approaches to height 66.3, and at 15:00 struck at concentrations of enemy armoured vehicles. Our own aviation regained air supremacy over our sector. The enemy used the days from April 9 to 11 for the last desperate attacks to break through the positions at Parpak and retake Crimea in the final phase of the Stalinist blow. He tried to occupy the Parpak corridor with a superior force of half a dozen rifle divisions and with the help of nearly 200 tanks. The enemy was forced to stop the attacks because of heavy losses. Again, in the battles against our defense line, the Soviets used up all their available reserves. Our division played a major role in the successful defense of the Parpacha positions. Having finally had a chance to catch our breath, we looked forward to and rest away from the constant shelling and threats of massed infantry attacks. Although it was not possible to withdraw an entire division from the front, individual battalions from our infantry regiments were withdrawn and sent to rest temporarily in the rear. Even for those who were fortunate enough to take advantage of the respite, the pause was not long, and after a short rest all were soon back at the front. Word reached us that we were being taken off the front for a rest. We dragged our feet through the mud with difficulty, following the tracks of our gun tractor in the direction of the village of Near Kamishai. For the first time in many days, the rumble of distant artillery behind us subsided. While in Blizny Kamishai, one number of our gun crew requisitioned without permission a goose from another unit's quarters. The unfortunate bird was plucked and promptly eaten by our voracious crew. Soon after the meal, a Hauptfeldwebel from the injured unit appeared in our lodgings with a rank insignia on his sleeve, indicating that he was the senior man in his company, and also with the ribbon of the Cross of Military Merit neatly inserted in his buttonhole. He also brought a subordinate with him in tow to witness what was happening. The cleanly nibbled goose bones lying next to the shell box did not go unnoticed by them. I, as gun commander, was demanded to give my name and the name of my unit. With a grunt, the Hauptfeld Fiebel carefully wrote this information down in his report book, which all non-commissioned officers carried in their left breast pocket. We paid little attention to his threats of retaliation and disciplinary action, letting the words pass our ears. After many months at the front, it was hard to imagine anything worse than what we had recently experienced, and we knew full well that the greater punishment for us was service on the Eastern Front. The regimental headquarters was also located at Middle Reeds. A few days later I received orders to report to the regimental command post. I tried to make a favourable impression, arriving on time, in a clean uniform, with a properly buckled belt and a cap worn on the head according to the regulations, as required by the rules of the German army. Alouet, a company commander's orderly, whistled as he greeted me and then said, "Do you guys have enough food there?" He interrupted his occupation and rushed into the building, but soon appeared in the doorway, signalling me to follow him. At the desk sat the adjutant, concentrating on a stack of papers spread out between several telephones and maps. I made a nervous attempt to click my heels, but it failed miserably because of the ugly layer of mud stuck to the soles of my boots. Then I spoke loudly. Private Biedermann reporting to regimental headquarters as ordered. As Hauptmann let me stand in silence for several long minutes without taking his eyes off his desk. Then he put the papers aside and looked at me. "If Luther Biedermann, I have here time." He picked out a document lying on the corner of the desk and waved it in my direction. "A theft report. What was stolen?" "A goose," I answered without hesitation. "And who is responsible for this theft?" "I am," I answered. "And where exactly was it stolen from?" asked the Hauptmann irritably. In my head whirled different thoughts. I was not prepared to explain in detail what I considered to be no more than a minor offence. He inferred from my hesitation to answer that I was trying to favour the soldiers of my unit who had committed the offence, and proceeded to lecture me on virtue and the importance of discipline, and that failure to meet these criteria could not and would not be tolerated. I was told that a report had been received recommending severe punishment. I was seized with a kind of stupor. I had no idea that stealing a goose would be taken so seriously. I tried to put thoughts of the severity of the punishment out of my mind and tried to concentrate on his words, which he kept pointing at me with the familiar clarity of a Spandau machine gun. Suddenly the Hauptmann abruptly cut short his speech, allowing silence to reign in the room for a few seconds, jumped up from the table and smiled. "Have a seat, Luther Biedermann," he said in a sharply changed human tone, gesturing to a vacant chair near his desk. Alois appeared immediately with 3 small cups made of shell casings. From somewhere under the table he took out a bottle of schnapps, filled them to the top, and we drank to our good old platoon. After a toast to the outstanding personalities familiar to both of us, and after answering questions concerning morale and supply of troops on the front line, I had to report in detail the last attempt of the enemy to break through our defences after the capture of the icebreaker where Field Fleet Kovacs was killed. Finally, after we drank a last toast, I was released without further threats. Months later, it came to my attention that the Hauptfeld Fiebel had indeed demanded punishment in his report. Our Hauptmann sent the report to the proper authorities. Coincidentally with this report, he also sent an eyewitness report of an incident which had been witnessed by several soldiers of the company on the same day, and the case concerned a Fieser Storch reconnaissance airplane. The witness claimed that he saw this plane land in a pasture in the rear of the division. Several officers jumped out of the plane and quickly loaded several sheep into the plane. The airplane immediately took off. Fortunately, the airplane number was recorded, and a subsequent cursory investigation revealed that this Fieser Stormer was assigned to Corps headquarters. On receipt of this report, which also recommended punishment for those responsible for the sheep theft, the authorities closed the case and it was never mentioned again. In April, we received a replacement on the front line. The company was withdrawn from its positions at the factory, the icebreaker and grasshopper, and we began to prepare to transfer firing positions to a new team from a sister regiment. Having emptied the cart of our personal belongings and light small arms, we left the ATP at the firing position and set off for Serigol. Leaving that place, we felt as if we had left a part of ourselves to the enemy. For many months, this gun served us faithfully while we dragged it in scalding heat and dust across Ukraine, in the fierce battles in which we desperately relied on its effectiveness against the advancing waves of enemy troops. This gun never failed us. It remained our faithful comrade during that winter of mud, snow, and ice near Sevastopol. We spent countless hours cleaning and polishing the low, double-layered gun shield and the long, wide carriage. Not a crumb of dust was to be found in the barrel and on the carriage. The gun was scarred by a few deep scratches, war wounds that had been diligently welded over, and the right side of the shield, pierced by multiple pieces of shrapnel, had been patched up by the maintenance company. Several white rings painted on the barrel just behind the muzzle spoke of the destruction of an equal number of enemy tanks. I instructed the field officer of the new calculation in detail on the rules of cannon maintenance. The breech and muzzle covers must always remain in place, even in the most forward positions, to protect the delicate mechanism from dust and moisture. The weather was getting warmer, but the nights were still cold. Therefore, to avoid condensation accumulation in the barrel, the breech cover must be removed and the breech block left open overnight. The morning sun warmed our exposed heads as we enjoyed the unusual luxury of walking at full height under a clear sky, without the burden of sapper tools and gas masks. Eventually we reached Serigol, the site of the former rear headquarters, where we were again able to wash and sleep and visit the soldiers' club in Feodosia, which had a movie theatre. The struggle for survival at the front, living in the mud, crawling through wet, muddy trenches or sitting curled up in dark, cold clay dugouts. All of this seemed to be behind us forever as we found a temporary illusion of peace under the spring sun in the Crimea. After a few days we were able to relax completely without the nervous anticipation of an enemy night attack that drummed in our subconscious. And the two truck drivers who had stayed in the rear with the supply men had prepared warm water and fresh clothes for our arrival. Mamushka, Maruzia and Pan greeted us with nods and smiles. Pan even took off his scribbled cap in greeting, and for the first time we saw his grey, hanging strands of hair. I reported the location of the calculation to the company's rear group. Hauptfeldwebel was at company headquarters, and Company Clerk Klump announced to me that nothing but the usual cleaning and maintenance of weapons had been provided for us, to which we were incredibly relieved. The next morning we were awakened by loud shouting nearby. Heinz had just brought in the coffee rations and rushed to me to inform me that the 3 Crimean hosts who had provided us with lodging had apparently had something stolen that night. I quickly pulled on my uniform and, walking down a wood-panelled corridor, found myself in the morning sun. A detached small structure in front of the house adjoined an ancient stone wall dating back to Ottoman times, and at the back of the wall was a small wooden shed, the door to which was open wide. In the door stood Mamushka and Barusia crying, and Pan was walking rapidly back and forth between the shed and the road, his dirty scribbled cap pulled low over his forehead. As I approached them, the women gesticulated excitedly, pointing to the awning. When I looked inside, I saw an empty stall. The dirty floor was strewn with straw and the dung of a recently departed guest. This, the cow had been stolen. I heard them exclaim. I was immediately seized with sympathy for the wretched figures standing before me. The pitiful figures standing before me. They must have had only this animal, which they had so diligently tended and successfully nursed through the winter. They told me that the cow was soon to calve and give milk. The 3 had succeeded in hiding the animal from us. Probably they feared that the invaders would requisition their only and most precious possession. 8 weeks ago, when we first lodged with them, I knew nothing of the cow's existence, but vaguely recalled seeing Pan slipping into the barn with a bucket of water or a bundle of straw. I tried to reassure the unhappy people. "The cow will come back," I promised, trying to comfort them, insulted that someone had entered the dwelling we had chosen and robbed our benefactors. We had already begun our search before noon. The 13th Company had a rear unit in the area, but questioning their field officer yielded nothing. We went through various rear units and a Coast Guard unit manning a huge shore gun, but again to no avail. We searched unsuccessfully behind fences, in ruined houses and various dwellings scattered around the site. The cow was not to be found. Romanian troops were stationed in the western sector of the Sarigol, Fetudosia area. We recognized the familiar earthen embankment and tank traps that surrounded Urod in a semicircle. Walking along the embankment, we heard in the distance a soft cow mooing. Continuing along the earthen wall, we came across several cows and sheep munching on the sparse dried grass of last year and diligently searching for the first green sprouts of spring. Hiding behind dwellings along the way, we passed the grazing animals in a wide arc until we reached an embankment. The dug trenches provided us with additional cover, which we used to get within 100 meters of the animals. Leaving the cover of the embankment, we crawled near the edge of the fence and approached a small herd of about 10 cows and 50 sheep, happily grazing under the protection of 2 silent Romanian soldiers huddled over a small fire with their backs to us. We quickly drew up a plan of attack. Hans and Wolf rushed with all their legs to the nearest cow. At first it continued to graze, seemingly oblivious to our presence, but then, noticing the intruders, it began to show signs of nervousness. The 2 crouched figures carefully and slowly drove the cow to the intended place, trying not to frighten the suspicious animal. The cow shunned the approaching foot soldiers, keeping a safe distance between herself and the 2 strangers. There were several puddles near the edge of the earth mound, which tempted the thirsty animal to come nearer. And as she approached the spot where we were hiding and lowered her head over one of the puddles, 4 pairs of hands clutched firmly at her horns. She sluggishly tried to free herself. A piece of Russian communication wire was quickly wrapped around her neck, and 2 in front and 2 behind. We began feverishly dragging and pushing the resisting animal along the embankment toward the low ground. Here we risked a quick glance over the fence. The Romanians noticed nothing. Only when we were in the safety of our bivouac did we give vent to our triumph at such prey. We stroked the wavy cow's hair and exchanged remarks on the merits of the wonderful animal. Although one of the soldiers in our group, who came from a peasant family, remarked that the cow was small and skinny. In the evening twilight, Wolf and Heinz led the cow to our dwelling. Mamushka, Maruzia, and Pan had already given up their hopeless search and were sitting dejectedly in the house when the 2 men stealthily led the cow into the barn and closed the door. I entered the house and astonished the owners with the message that the cow was back. All 3 hastily jumped up when I gestured for them to follow me, and stopped in amazement in front of the half-dark barn. The animal raised its muzzle and sniffed cautiously at its new owners. Then Pan excitedly explained to me that their previous cow was small, and this one was big. After repeating Nishevo and Karasho many times, I told him that he could keep this one. Tears appeared in the old man's eyes, and he tried to hug my knees. And it was only with an effort that I was able to protect myself from an unexpected, unwanted, and embarrassed display of gratitude. That evening we joined our hosts in celebrating the cow's return with sweetened hot tea. We had requisitioned chickens, geese and eggs from our hosts in previous months, and were now more than satisfied to be able to repay their generosity. The Crimean spring started early. In the middle of April we moved again to permanent quarters in houses at Fedosia and Sarigol, which we still had only because our driver in our absence had successfully defended the place from the encroachments of other units while we were fighting at the icebreaker, at the plant, and at altitude 66.3. The 14th Company, 437th Regiment, was now commanded by Lieutenant Zoll, a professional officer who was always attentive to the needs and problems of the infantrymen. Everyone in the company could go straight to him when needed to share problems. Once I heard David and Conrad, the two horsemen of our company, cursing our Berlin leadership and especially the Führer in brown in their strong Swabian Bavarian dialect when they once again had to leave their warm apartments in Surreygold because of troop redeployment. Of course, the Swabian greetings heard from these two did not go unnoticed, and some type with strong National Socialist convictions would have considered this outburst grounds for a report of defeatist sentiment, or even attributed it to demoralization. Such misdemeanors were punished by being sent to punitive units or worse. The reasoning used was that if such backbiting was allowed, it would breed resentment and spread defeatist sentiment in the troops. Our company commander, a professional officer to the bone, who deeply understood life at the front, from the point of view of the trench soldiers, believed that if the soldiers had the energy to curse their situation, then life in the trenches remained normal, although their criminal behaviour was the result of straightforward and intemperate characters. In other respects, the pair continued to prove themselves as reliable and brave lads. Conrad earned the Iron Cross for his actions while participating in my gun crew in the battle against the tanks on the Mackenzie Mountains. In February, he always managed to supply us with food and ammunition with his cart, despite the harsh and extremely difficult conditions that existed on the Parpach line. One night he arrived at our position earlier than usual. When asked the reason for this early appearance, he made it clear that in going around a swamp, he had taken too much to the left. He denied that he had come by a shortcut through a Russian minefield, which was clearly marked and fenced in with marking white tape forbidding passage, and yet it was the only road he could take to cover that distance in a limited period of time. The only way we could explain his successful crossing of the minefield was that the ground above the surface of the mines was frozen, or the ice between the pressure plates and the detonators had not thawed. Throughout his time fighting on the Eastern Front, he seemed to be protected by a personal guardian angel, and this soldier became one of the few in the company to survive the war. Again at night came frost and complete darkness, although after unloading the wagon Conrad insisted that he would go back to headquarters. I ordered him to stay with us until dawn. He obeyed unquestioningly and was rewarded for his obedience with warm schnapps. After taking care of the horses, covering them with ponchos made of old woolen blankets, he secured the cart in place by inserting a stopper between the spokes before returning to the warmth of the stove in the dugout. Despite the night's rifle and machine gun fire, when tracer bullets could be seen bouncing off obstacles and flying in a curved trajectory into the darkness, the horses remained calm. After they had faithfully served the German Wehrmacht for many months, these horses were already accustomed to the night noise of the front. They only stepped lightly in the darkness and chewed contentedly on the straw from the roof that Conrad had brought them. Even they were feeling the effects of the overstretching of our transport communications, for all we could give them was rough straw. As it began to get light, Conrad returned to the horses and found that their front hooves had frozen into the deep mud. He had to free them by cutting them out of the ice with a pickaxe, and the sun was already rising behind the Russian positions when he rode off, shouting commands to his pair of horses. His departure was marked by the distant boom of a Maxim machine gun in the front line, and a few bullets crashed into the ground nearby. In the light of the coming day he made an attractive and not very distant target for the ever-vigilant gentleman in the trenches opposite us. The next evening Conrad's wagon again arrived at our position, delivering the materials we so badly needed. Soon after his arrival he clearly lost his temper as he listened to our complaints about the bread smelling of gasoline. In an even greater wound to his pride, I accused him of putting the bread next to the canister of fuel oil when loading it. He returned the next day without a canister of fuel, and we spent the night in the dark, using the last of the diesel fuel to heat the food and keep a semblance of warmth in the dugout. Despite the heap of insults we heaped on Conrad yesterday, the bread still tasted like it had been dipped in diesel. Only a few weeks later did we learn that the personnel of the bread company had discovered some grain stores in the port of Kerch. Before leaving, the Russians poured fuel on the grain and set it on fire. Fortunately, only the top layer was burned, and the rest of the grain only soaked in smoke and smelled bad. But in the opinion of the German army intendants, this discovery was just unexpected luck, and the grain was considered quite suitable for use. To improve the critical food supply situation, the grain was used to bake bread that smelled like diesel fuel and tasted. We had no idea that before our odyssey in the Soviet Union was over, we would still yearn for the taste of a piece of bread half as good as this one. After we had redeployed to Sarigol, there was one more duty to fulfill to our comrades. We gathered bouquets of the first spring flowers from the surrounding hills and found the divisional cemetery in Feodosia. The battles in Parpacha, the offensive on Kerch, and the capture of Feodosia cost our division dearly. Those who died on the battlefield and died of wounds in hospitals were buried in a park-like garden near the building built in the Tsarist times. The huge, impressive-looking house was built in the Ottoman style and was situated on a hill overlooking the bay, surrounded by pine trees and majestic cypresses. Our divisional cemetery was laid out shortly after the capture of Theodosia, January 18. Many of the graves were still marked by simple wooden crosses with a single inscription, "Unknown German Soldier." There rested several hundred of our comrades who had been lying wounded in hospitals when the Russian paratroopers landed in early January. During the landing, which forced Count Spinek to effect a fatal withdrawal, the wounded were left in the care of the medics. After being captured by the Russians, many were immediately shot where they lay. Others, including many who could not walk, were stripped of their clothes, dragged to the seashore where they were doused with water and left to die in the cold. These atrocities took place before the eyes of the few survivors, and their accounts are corroborated by reports from many division soldiers who discovered these victims after the city was recaptured. The graves of these unidentified soldiers were at the edge of the cemetery. In the center were buried those soldiers of our division who had given their lives in the preceding 4 months of the war. In the most prominent spot of the cemetery stood a massive monument, and on its base of white limestone were carved the words, "They fell for Great Germany in the battle for Theodosia." 132nd Infantry Division. Years later I got a picture of the memorial from General Lindemann's personal effects, and on the back of it the general had written, "Worth dying for." We would find the graves of our company mates and mark them with flowers, carefully laying them on the recently disturbed ground. To this day, soldiers lie in Russian soil, having died in the attacks on Feodosia and Kerch, at Parpacha, at the White House, at altitude 66.3, and on the icebreaker. Ironically, impressive cemeteries and impressive memorials were built for those who fell in battle, but those who died in the rear from wounds or disease were not even left with boots on their feet. By official order, boots were supposed to be removed from the dead for further use by someone else, because leather became a rare commodity. And with the further progress of the war, it was rare for the dead to be left with even a cloak tent to wrap them in. Corpses, dismembered and torn in battle, were placed in shallow graves and covered with earth. Ash-coloured faces, with half-open mouths and empty eye sockets staring unseeingly into the sky, they seemed to ask, "Why did I have to die? It's not like I haven't lived yet, and before my last journey, you even took the boots off my feet. My loyalty to you and my thoughts remain with you, from this grave to eternity. Therefore remain in peace, my dear friends, my faithful comrades." Having suffered a major defeat in Feodosia, the Russian 44th Army withdrew with the remnants of thoroughly battered divisions to the heavily fortified Parpacha positions, and from January 20 took refuge in a well-planned line of defense. The enemy's goal was to stop further German advance on the Parpacha positions and behind their protective barrier to reform and rearm the defeated units, as well as to deploy new divisions in preparation for a new offensive. The enemy was preparing to recapture at any cost the territory we now occupied. Sunny Crimea, the jewel of Soviet Russia, was considered strategically priceless. The plan was to cut off the German 11th Army by a blow on Perikop, encircle and destroy it, and thus make the entire German southern front falter from a blow on its exposed right flank. Recapturing Crimea was also a matter of prestige for the Soviets. With this planned strike, The Red commanders hoped to end the threat of permanent occupation of the Crimea by the German Wehrmacht and prevent its long-term presence in the Caucasus and the Black Sea. In the words of a Soviet commissar, victory in the Crimea is the key to the overall defeat of the enemy. To end the German presence in the Crimea, many troops and hundreds of armoured vehicles were concentrated on the Kerch Peninsula. The enemy was confident of an undoubted victory. Since the end of January, new divisions had been moved from the Caucasus to Kerch and Kamish-Burun, with many crossing the ice to the areas of concentration. On January 25, the German forces consisted of 4 German and Romanian divisions, and against them were 2 Russian armies consisting of 9 divisions and 2 rifle brigades. By February 26, the Soviet forces had been increased to 12 rifle divisions and 1 cavalry division, with 2 rifle brigades and 2 tank brigades in reserve. Opposite the XX Army Corps sector, which was held by a force of only 1 division, was the Russian 44th Army of 5 divisions. The battered German units, which had fought hard for Sevastopol and Feodosia, were facing a superior enemy who had brought forward fresh, fully re-equipped Russian divisions. The weeks that followed January 20 on the front remained quiet, broken only by minor sorties, which were reduced to a limited reconnaissance of the enemy's defences, with the opponents suffering small losses. During this period, the Soviets systematically reinforced their forces. A major Russian offensive was predicted for February 23, 1942, the day of the traditional Red Army holiday, and as a special gift to the Russian people, Crimea should be returned to. But here came and passed the predicted date. Because of endless rains and low clouds, the offensive on February 27. The offensive began along the entire front with unimaginable fury. Numerous chains were coming at us: 7 rifle divisions, 2 rifle brigades and 2 armoured brigades. On the positions of XXX and XXI Army Corps fell merciless artillery fire, and the main blow came to the last corps. The purpose of the offensive was to take the railroad junction in Vladislavlivka, an important point on the route, which was the supply of German troops. Other combat operations in the direction of Feodosia and Dzankoy had the purpose to destroy German troops in these strategically important areas. As a result, the offensive of 3 Soviet divisions, which had 60 tanks, 22 batteries of all calibers and strong air support, was thwarted by a single German division, the 132nd Infantry Division. All attacks were repulsed with heavy losses for the enemy. The Soviets were eventually able to break through the northern flank of XX Corps, but were quickly repulsed and the breakout point was closed. During the attacks, the enemy forces suffered heavy losses in men and equipment, and in order to accomplish their remaining tasks, these formations needed to be first of all rearmed and replenished. First of all, the enemy positions east and west of the anti-tank ditch were reinforced. The failure of these enemy attacks, which did not result in a major breakthrough, and the ensuing decline in activity helped German commanders conclude that the enemy infantry was close to exhaustion. Despite the immeasurable losses, the Soviet plan to recapture the Crimea was not abandoned. By mid-March, enemy forces on the peninsula had been reinforced with 13 rifle divisions, 1 cavalry division, 3 additional rifle brigades, and 4 armoured brigades. The replenished enemy forces resumed their assault on the positions of the XX and XXI Corps, Soviet troops, now consisting of 13 rifle divisions, 3 rifle brigades and 4 armoured brigades, reinforced by powerful artillery and aviation formations, rashly rush into the German positions without success. Tattered German defence line, although not receiving reinforcements, continued to hold. Fresh Anglo-American influence on the course of the war became more evident. New American-made vehicles were seen in large numbers. On medical supplies captured from Soviet units, the names and labelling were in English. Despite the impressive aid coming from the other side of the Atlantic, the situation did not change. Prisoners of war and deserters repeatedly claimed that the Russian soldiers had lost faith in victory, and that the task of liberating Crimea, set by Stalin personally, must be accomplished at any cost. Therefore, chains of Soviet soldiers continue to attack German trenches, energized by a combination of fervent patriotism and fear of the political commissaires.